Good afternoon. On behalf of Private School Village, I want to thank you for joining us today for our conversation about racial literacy. My name is Lisa Johnson, and I have the pleasure of running this wonderful organization. Before I introduce our guests, I want to remind you of what you probably just heard. We're recording today's program, and we'll make it available following the event on our PSV YouTube channel. And also following Dr. Stevenson's remarks, excuse me, we'll be monitoring the Q&A feature on Zoom. And if time permits, we'll be pulling questions from it. I'll caution you, however, with an hour and a half of time, it is really unlikely that we're going to get to everyone's questions. And that's one reason why we're also offering a deeper dive for adults on October 3rd with a racial literacy skill building workshop facilitated by the Lion Story. The Lion Story is an organization that helps people learn useful skills to have productive conversations about race. And I have participated in their institute. And I'll just say it was life-changing because it guides you to understand race in vulnerable ways that perhaps you haven't fully considered. And more important, it prepares you to anticipate future racially stressful situations in a way that protects you. So we'll open up registration for that workshop after today's program. Today's topic is central to Private School Village's mission. Racial literacy is a programmatic pillar of PSV as it offers a way for families and schools to prepare children with the tools needed to deal with racially stressful situations. That's something that's going to serve them not only as they navigate private school, but throughout life. Today, we have several middle and high school students with us who will be in conversation with Dr. Stevenson. We felt it was important to center their voices and give them the opportunity to engage with Dr. Stevenson first and foremost. I've asked them to stay muted until after Dr. Stevenson's opening remarks, but quickly, I want to introduce them. They are Sayla, she's an 8th grader at Westside Neighborhood School. Zanaya, who's in 9th grade at Brentwood. Remy, who's in 11th grade at Brentwood. Isaiah, who's in 11th at Crossroads. Samuel, who's in 12th grade at Crossroads. Adrian, who's in 8th grade at Crossroads. Manaya, who's in 8th grade at Marlboro. And Spencer, who's in 11th grade at Marlboro. 9 fabulous students. So thank you to each of the students and their families for participating in today's program. Now, Dr. Stevenson needs little introduction with this community. Many of us are in his fan club. He is a nationally sought expert on how racial stress and racial trauma can affect every stage of life. His work focuses on how educators, community leaders, and parents can emotionally resolve face-to-face racially stressful encounters that reflect racial profiling in public spaces, fuel social conflicts in neighborhoods, and undermine student emotional well-being and academic achievement in the classroom. Dr. Stevenson is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education, Professor of Africana Studies in the Graduate School of Education at UPenn. He's Executive Director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, an organization that brings together community leaders, researchers, families, and youth to study and promote racial literacy and health in schools and neighborhoods. And he's also the Director of Forward Promise, a national program that supports organizations working to improve the health of boys and young men of color and their families as they heal from the trauma of historical and present day dehumanization and discrimination. Dr. Stevenson is one of the nation's foremost experts on racial literacy and author of Promoting Racial Literacy in Schools, Differences That Make a Difference. Dr. Stevenson, thank you for being here today. And if you will kindly just get us started by telling us more about racial literacy. I will be the first to admit that I naively thought racial literacy meant being literate about race, and it is so much more. If you will get us started by telling us what racial literacy is, why it's important, and how it works.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson. I'm so excited to be here. It's such an honor to be back also with you. I had the best time when I was out before the pandemic. Very soulful time with parents and young folks. I'll start off like I usually do, like we do at Line Story, around a notion of a story. And the story is very important to us. There's a lot of reasons why we focus on story. When I first came to University of Pennsylvania, and I'll share my slides in a second, I was very excited because I had spent quite a bit of time as a clinical psychologist running residential treatment centers for abused youth. And I finally, despite all that energy, I was writing and I didn't have the time to write. So when I came to the University of Penn as an assistant professor, I was very excited because finally I had the time to colleagues and I, we would write together, we would go to the coffee houses, we would read each other's work, we would look into each other's eyes and hold hands and skip into the sunset of academic nirvana. I had all these dreams. And after a year of trying my best to be the kind and gentle colleague, the non-threatening Black person, I knew that race was going to be an issue as the only Black psychologist in a department. So I tried ever so slightly to win that Professor Congeniality Award by the end of the year. And I decided that I was going to ever so slightly shapeshift myself so that I would not have, maybe in a sense, the theory was if I could be less threatening to my colleagues, because I know they were a little sheepish about the topic of race, that maybe they would come out of their caves and huts and then we could go to the coffee houses and we could look into each other's eyes and we could read each other's work and we could skip into that sunset. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. And after a year of disillusionment, there was no hand holding, there was no skipping, no sharing each other's work. I would read my colleagues' work, but they would not read mine. And so I became quite upset at the end of the year. And mostly because I put out a lot of energy. And this notion of shapeshifting, if I can share it with you, part of the notion of shapeshifting is trying to alter myself and my talk in a way to make other people feel less comfortable. And sometimes that really meant hiding pieces of myself. And so in my first year, after my first year, I was quite disillusioned. I decided on my way back into my second year that I was going to change my game. Because shapeshifting didn't work. It didn't bring and secondly, it's kind of grandiose of me to think that I could change another person's fear of my race or my ideas simply by trying to act differently. And so I came back in the second year, my slides aren't quite working right now, but I'm just going to go ahead. I came back with a very different resolve, and I said to myself, I belong here at the University of Pennsylvania, but I do not fit in. I don't know if you've ever had a space where you walked into a room or belonged to a group, but you didn't feel like you fit in. And in that sense, I think I lost you. Are you still there? Okay.
Yes.
Great. I feel like I belong, but I did not fit in. And the way I defined this, that I said that I belong here at Penn, do not fit in, and that was going to be okay for me. And the way I defined belonging was, do I accept myself? Do I accept my people, my culture? Do I accept my competence? The answer was yes. I can do clinical psychology. I can write papers and research. And even if I have to do it by myself, I can do that. But I define fitting in as, do I want to depend on other people accepting me, my culture, my people, my difference? And the answer to that was no, particularly if shapeshifting was going to be the way that I was going to go about it. And I came back in the second year with a very different resolve. And I came across an African proverb that goes, the lion story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. Now, the funny thing about that proverb is a lot of people think I'm so glad I'm not the hunter. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you can look at Proverbs in many different ways. The way that we have looked at it is that any of us could be the lion or the hunter, depending on our perspective. But a key message in that proverb is that everybody has a powerful and important racial story. My racial story is not better than yours, and yours is no better than mine. Everybody's racial story is important. And it is really a truism that it's not anyone else's fault if I don't know my own racial story. I can't blame the left, I can't blame the right. And so in that sense, I went back in that second year with a very different sense. Now, it's quite true that if I assert my story or you assert your racial story, not everybody's going to like it. And it's why I love this poem by Nayyirah Waheed. Some people, when they hear your story, contract. Others, upon hearing, expand. And this is how you know. And so for the most of my 30 years, going on 32 years now at Penn, I have decided that I'm going to tell my story, even if people don't like it. But that's not my real problem. The real problem is how much I'm going to embrace my own narrative. Now, what do we know about race and racial moments? The way that we focus on at the Line Story and in our work at the Racial Empowerment Collaborative is we think of racial encounters as moments that can happen in the space of seconds. And if you look at
Uh-oh. Okay, I think we lost Dr. Stevenson. Yes, we did. Okay, we're going to pause and try and get him back on the line. Herb that he just spoke about. Do you understand what it means? The lion story and the African proverb? I see a head nodding. Does anyone want to take a stab at explaining what you think it means? Don't be shy.
I think kind of like what Dr. Stevenson was saying, a lot of it has to do with the way that you tell your own story and kind of not changing it for your audience. And when you have a story that other people may not like, you still want to share your story because there's always going to be people who can take something from it.
Excellent. Anyone else? Right? Like if you don't take the power to share your own story, right? The story will always be the hunter's version. But we have the power to also be the hunter.
Mhm.
I'm going to read some of these comments from the Q&A. Thank you, Eden. She says, nothing but grace. We're with you. Thank you, because I'm over here freaking out, trying to multitask. Oh, Dr. Stevenson, it seemed to work. Sorry, I'm multitasking. I did say that right.
Can you hear me now?
There you are.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know what happened, but
I don't either. It's technology. And our lovely audience has been great. And our students were chiming in about what they think the proverb means.
yes, I heard a little bit. Shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can share my screen again. That might have been part of it. Can you give me permission one more time? Let's try
yes.
this.
Absolutely.
Thank you. All right. Let's see let me know if you can see the screen.
Yep.
Okay. So this is what I was mentioning around the notion of belonging versus fitting in. Once I realized that I belonged at the University of Pennsylvania, but I did not fit in. It helped me to stop worrying about what other people thought. And I took it on as a badge of honor. And then realizing in the 30 years that we've been doing research on independent schools for Black and brown children and families, that there's something special about not fitting in, particularly in spaces that aren't prepared for us. So this notion of line story, as Selah was just describing, is right on. And this poem by Nayyirah Waheed is very important. How are you going to navigate the world when other people don't appreciate your story? And I think we're in a time right now where that's extremely important. So when we think about systemic racism, we're very interested in how policies and practices in institutions carry with them an oppression against people who are different, whether it's direct or indirect, whether it's blatant or subtle. We know that those are very important politics that have to be addressed and disrupted. But though a lot of our work at the Line Story and the Racial Empowerment Collaborative is around racial encounters that happen in less than a few seconds, in less than a couple of minutes. And we think about them as moments that embody our past, our present, and anticipation of interactions. And all of that weighs heavy on our ability to feel, to check our bodies and cognitions, and that the body reactions, thoughts, and feelings that are going on can happen in a moment. All of that can be so overwhelming that we are overtaxed. And so we're interested in how do we help folks when they're overtaxed in these ways, because we need folks to find their voice. So a lot of our work is around what happens in a face-to-face encounter and in the moment, because a lot of negative outcomes occur from in-your-face racial encounters that take less than 2 minutes. And so we've got to come up with a strategy. And a legal approach is not going to help us navigate what to do when we only have a few minutes or less to make a healthy decision. The research says a lot about how stressful these racial encounters are going. Even the ones we predict are going to happen, if we're not prepared for them, they will overwhelm us. Racial encounters are stressful for a lot of reasons. One way we know that racial stress affects us is how when we're overwhelmed at high levels, let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10, 8, 9, and 10 is pretty high, we think about that as threat, not just stress, as racial threat. And we know that in the literature that racial threat distorts our perceptions. What Claude Steele talks about as a racing mind is sometimes I'm so eager to say the right thing or do the right thing that I work overtime. My brain is working overtime, so much so that I work so hard that I will see some things right in front of me and not see other things right in front of me. You ever lose your keys and you go looking all over the place and you go to your car thinking you left them there and they're right back when you come back in the house, they're right there where you found them. Well, that's an example of your brain working overtime where you can't see everything right in front of you. You're blocking out what's right in front of you. And so the same happens in a racial moment. Imagine having a racial discussion and part of your brain losing peripheral vision and hearing is there and the other part is someplace else. You hear some of it, you hear not all of it, how difficult it is to have a racial conversation. We know also in the literature that racial threat also is fatiguing to the body and our thoughts. The perseveration of what we did before, what we've gone through in the past, as well as the fear of hypervigilance of the future, what might happen, all impact our perceptions and how we see things. Racial stress also harms our health. We know a lot more now about, as a person of color, many of us feel inclined to try to prove to people we're just as smart as everybody else, what Dr. Sherman James calls John Henryism. We know through decades of studies how racial stress affects cardiovascular disease, or it's contributory. If you look at the work of David Williams out of Howard University and others, even in the context of breast cancer for Black women, there are racial predictive factors. And then even sleep quality in teenagers. We know that racism affects sleep quality in adults, but it's also true for young people that if you are even subtly worried about what's going to happen because of your difference, it's going to affect you even when you're not awake. But racial stress also harms our healing and our healers, right? In a lot of ways that if we're not aware of it, even when we're trying to exercise, even when we're trying to better ourselves, we will find if we don't pay attention to even the race-specific factors, we also will not be at our best in the process of healing. So what do we do about it? Well, I have a theory. I'm not going to bore you, but the bottom line is if we can find a way to reduce racial stress, it will build our racial confidence. My question that I've been interested in for 30 years is called racial socialization. And it means in a nutshell, does it help? Is it helpful when parents talk to their children about race? And it so happens that we've learned a lot from a lot of colleagues that yes, the talk, as many people think about it, is very helpful in giving young people a different way to look at how the world sees them. And so being prepared for racial hate reduces racial stress by improving confidence, by improving self-efficacy. If you look at the literature and some of the work that we've done at the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, you'll find that the more that parents have talked to their children about race, whether parents say it or children say it, there's increases around improved thinking and behavioral competence in preschoolers. Teenagers demonstrate greater self-esteem, anger management, more mature racial identity and academic achievement. And parents who are also engaged in racial socialization are more likely to get better at navigating the politics of race in their own lives and worry less about their children's ability to navigate those politics. And finally, in some of our projects where we teach people how to talk about race, better family communication. What is racial literacy, though? And that's a question Ms. Johnson's asked. And in a nutshell, racial literacy is the ability to read, recast, and resolve during a racially stressful encounter or racially stressful moment, right? Reading would be the ability to see racial elephants in the room. Some people see them, some people don't. Doesn't make them bad people. It's just that the ability to notice what's going on is key. Then the ability to decode both the verbal and nonverbal communication that goes on in a racial moment is essential. And finally, do I make the more accurate interpretation of what just happened? So reading is fundamental to racial literacy. Recasting is about how do I reduce my 8, 9, and 10 and bring it down to a 5, 6, or 7. And that requires a kind of mindfulness. And part of the mindfulness approach that we use involves reframing the impossible to become possible. From 8, 9, and 10 is like facing a tsunami or a poisonous snake, very threatening. How do I bring it down to a mountain, 5, 6, or 7? Challenging, but not impossible. And the approach that we use is called CLCBE, calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. And in a sense, it's a mindfulness approach that's going to help us, that has been helpful in the way that we can, in the moment, make some very powerful adjustments. Calculate, the first C, stands for what feeling am I having right now? And how intense are they? So let's say somebody calls me a racial slur that I don't like. I'm angry. I get angry at a 9, right? And I get sad at a 7. So that's calculate, right? Locate is where in my body do I feel those feelings? I'm angry at a 9 and I feel it on the back of my neck, like my neck is on fire. And I'm sad at a 7 in my gut because the person who said that to me was somebody I thought I could trust. It feels like betrayal, like a kick in the gut. That's locate. Communicate is often we talk to ourselves when we're under duress, and we also see images in our minds. We call that self-talk and memory. To what degree do I notice what I'm saying to myself? And an example would be, I'm so angry at this person, I thought I could trust them. How dare they call me that name? And images that come to mind are the last time I got called that name. I can go back to college. I remember when I got into a fight over that on a soccer field. Communicate. What am I saying to myself through imagery and self-talk? finally, breathe and exhale happens throughout all of this. It allows, let's say we're at an 8, 9, and 10, and our brains are on lockdown and we lose peripheral vision and hearing. We can't see to the left or hear to the left or right. Breathing in slowly and exhaling even slower brings oxygen to our brain so that we can make better decisions, because what? We open up our peripheral vision and hearing, and there's much more information available to us. So that's reading is, do I see the racial elephant? Recasting, can I reduce the stress of the racial moment? Resolving is, can I make a healthy decision that's not an under or overreaction? Underreaction is where I pretend that the racial encounter bothered me when it really did, that it did not bother me when it really did bother me. And overreaction is when I curse out everybody, including the cat, the dog, and inanimate objects, and they had nothing to do with the situation. Resolving is not solving racism. It's really about how well can I engage the moment rather than run from it? How well can I assertively speak up to it? And can my social justice beliefs match my actions? Can my actions match my beliefs? These are just a few of the projects that we have done, training teachers in the Can We Talk project, training barbers to be health educators to Black men, the play project where we use basketball on the court to try to help young people, boys and girls and adults, how to navigate stress in the moment. Basketball can be one of those very stressful kinds of events. And the Embrace project, where we actually teach families as a whole. And finally, as the founder of Lion Story Village, preparing professionals. All of these use racial literacy skills that I'm describing for you today in the process. I will also say that we've also been consultant to Sesame Street. And if you go to Sesame Street's Racial Justice Initiative, you will hear or you will see a lot of the notion of how to breathe and share, breathe, feel, and share for younger children. There are ways that younger children can even go through these kinds of issues. So I'm going to end right now. I just want to end with some take-home points. One, racial literacy take-home points. One, racial stress affects our bodies, our feelings, and our thoughts. But how we manage those feelings and thoughts can in many respects, be quite powerful. But not to manage what's going on in our bodies, feelings, and thoughts will impair our perceptions, our decision-making, the behaviors that we go through. Feeling threatened by racial moments, or fight, flight, or fright is very human. Nothing wrong with that. Avoiding these things are also very human, but it will leave us incompetent and probably unethical if we don't face these things. Racial stress is observable, it's resolvable, but only if we face it. Facing it means we are courageous, and racial literacy is not about blame, but preparation. It's about accountability, but not blame. Okay? Questions we ask everybody, are we prepared, right? That deer in the headlights. You ever have that moment where you wish you could have, should have been that, making stand up for that moment? Well, part of our job is to prepare folks, young people, for those moments so that they don't linger, so they can find their voice. So the question we ask everybody, what's your racial story? And based on that proverb in our work in Lion Story, we say, tell your story, you can heal the village. Thank you. I'm going to stop there. And I know that our students have some wonderful questions. And I believe we'll start with Selah. I believe you have a question you'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Stevenson. Why is it important to prepare for racially stressful situations, and how can students begin to build racial literacy skills each day?
Well, part of the reason it's important is the way I try to explain it. We would not be here if racial stressful moments didn't bother you or didn't linger for months or years at a time. I get the pleasure of traveling the country or speaking to folks around the country, and I have run into third graders who say the same thing as folks in their 80s when I ask them to tell a story, and many of them will go back. Third grader said to me at a school in Texas, when we went through her story. I'm so angry. I can still remember someone saying something to me in the first grade, and it still bothers me. And I've had 80-year-olds talk about when they were 6. So the idea behind why we need to do this is, if we don't address racial stress or racial rejection or racial microaggressions in the moment, it tends to linger with us. And none of us, regardless of our racial background, gender, sexuality, should ever accept dehumanization, not subtly or blatantly. And there's no way that we have the capacity to somehow swallow hate. It's just not healthy. But psychologically, even when we think we're okay, so we need the skills. And so the practice I would say that you need is to have a group of folks that you can trust, who won't judge you for telling your story, who will appreciate the nuance about how you tell your story. Some of us tell our story with style, with attitude, with lots of expression, and we need people around us. And I would say practicing calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. I'm a little biased to that degree. And I think you can use any strategy that you find natural. But the question is, does it help you in less than 2 minutes, right? Because if we can't make healthy decisions to speak up, or to stand up for someone in those moments, 2 minutes is a very long period of time. And again, I think it stays with us if we don't practice. Thank you for that question, Selah. Anyone else have a question? Yes, Isaiah?
I have a question, and it's kind of a follow-up question on that.
Okay.
And the question comes from an anonymous person. How do you suggest dealing with racially stressful situations caused by our own race? And the anonymous person who submitted this question from the PSV community says, colorism issues between light skin and dark skin, Blacks or African Americans is a thing in my school. So how do you deal with it caused by our own race?
Okay, thank you. I didn't hear all of that, but I think if I can say it back again, it sounds like you're asking me about what if people from your own race challenge you and bringing up the issue of colorism. I think I would make the very same argument. And for some of us, colorism is even, first of all, it's dehumanizing. So the notion of dehumanization is central. The fact that you are treated less than human by anyone is not only unacceptable, but it's going to have some long-term consequences. But for many of us, when it's somebody who looks like us, where we don't expect that, it can be quite disturbing. And while some of us are pretty good at facile with responding to somebody who doesn't look like us, some of our families who racially socialize or talk to children prepare us for cross-race hostility. They don't always talk about folks who look like us, or even folks in our families. And we know those contribute to the same outcomes that we've described. One of the best researchers, Dr. Taylor out of University of Pittsburgh for decades, studied issues of within race hostility and dehumanization, and found that it affected marital relationships, it affected self-esteem, affected a host of health issues. So the same strategies, I think, would apply. And when back to Selah's question, I think part of those strategies of practicing CLCBE is how you take care of yourself. How do you make better decisions? But it also is about, how do I stand up for myself in that moment, right? Because many of us feel like the best way to protect ourselves is to get away from that hostility. And to some degree, it helps maybe break the pressure of the moment. But in the long run, we still remember the moment. So part of what we can do with the racial literacy I'm proposing is to eventually stand up as opposed to just simply walk away. Great question, Isaiah. Yes, Adrian.
My question was, When is the appropriate age to teach younger children about racially stressful situations in a way that prepares them but doesn't steal their innocence? Do you wait for something to happen?
I don't think we can wait for something to happen because, it's not like you would, wait till you hit water to teach somebody to swim, right? You wouldn't say, okay, I'm going to hold off on the swimming lesson. I'm going to wait till you find water and then we'll teach you how to swim. There's a way in which race is one of those things we often do want to wait. And I think part of it is out of fear that bringing up the hostilities of the world will change our children. Parents say this to me all the time. The problem is, if we look at when does racism start affecting young people, we know very early on that children, as young as infants, have a way to distinguish according to skin color who is like them. And in that regard, some might argue, and my mother would be one of them when she was alive, that you start very early talking and preparing. Others, though, when we look at in which systems do we find racism playing its role, we found in preschool, there are disproportionate expulsions, even as young as preschool, by race. And it's unrelated to children's behavior. It's really about adults making egregious, what a colleague of mine calls irrational judgments. And I just call it racial threat, that even it's hard to believe that some educators can be threatened by the behavior of 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. That is a truism that's been happening for decades. We're now learning about that. My colleague, Walter Gilliam out of Yale, has been studying this for decades. So if you're a parent and you say, wow, my child could run into racism in preschool, should I start later? Wait till they get to 8th grade? And I would say no, start early. And I think the other thing to answer the back of your question is, will they lose their innocence? I think parents are in the best space to give love while they're talking about the hostility, because that hostility does not have to define you, right? That's what others do. That's how others are thinking about you. You are loved, and we still have to prepare you for a world that might be a struggle. It's all not like that, but I'd rather you be prepared than shocked. And in many respects, we find, even here at Penn, some of the students who come at Penn have their first racial experience. Those who are not prepared are often blown away because they're just not used to it. Thank you. Someone else had their hand up, I believe, before. Okay. Samuel, I see you, Samuel.
Yeah, so my question comes from a personal experience. And a little story behind that. So back in middle school, my school had an assembly about microaggressions, and people didn't really take that seriously. There were jokes around the school for the next month after that. But ironically, later in the school year, the middle school dean, who knew me pretty well, called me by the name of another Black student. And eventually she apologized, but her apology was very backhanded and was essentially a microaggression. She said something along the lines of, I'm sorry for calling you by somebody else. You're better than most of the Black students or all of the other Black students. So how do we best prevent and deal with racial microaggressions coming from faculty?
Okay, now I'm going to say great, and I do this a lot, not because I say great that you had to go through that experience, but great that you're courageous enough to talk about it. And the way that I would teach people generally, and what will happen when my team comes from Lion Story, is that we're interested in every experience that you have. So many of you who just heard Samuel's story, if I just take the young people that I'm seeing, when you heard Samuel's story, did any of you have a reaction? Okay, so if we just went back to calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale, before I asked Samuel's reaction to his story, what did you notice about yourself when you heard Samuel's story? And maybe you had a reaction before Samuel finished his story. Maybe you had a reaction after. But first of all, like if you said anything, what did you notice about your feelings while you were listening to Samuel's story? Anybody? Scylla, thank you.
Well, I immediately felt a very strong connection, and it just felt like that was a problem that a lot of students at many different schools have encountered. And so as soon as the story started, I could kind of tell where it was going. So it just felt weird knowing that a lot of us have this very common but not so positive experience.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Scylla. Weird, like on a scale of 1 to 10, how weird would you say you felt? 10 being like very extremely weird, and 1 being minimally weird.
I would probably say about a 5, because
Okay.
it was it felt strange, but at the same time, I wasn't surprised.
Yeah, thank you. How many of you also had noticed that you had a feeling that's maybe different than what Scylla had? And if you can, open your mic and share what feeling. And then I'm going to ask you about your body, and I'm going to ask you about your thoughts. Anybody else have a feeling? Yes, Spencer, thank you.
I won't lie, I sort of had like this scared feeling. I've had incidents where like it's an encounter with like a teacher or someone that's like above you in that sense. And those kind of like scare me the most, because it's like they're an adult. And how do you handle that with that, you know, student teacher relationship? And when they're supposed to be a person that's supposed to be helping you and, you know, facilitating your education and, you know, to inspire you and move you along. So it's really like hard to be in that.
Yes. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much scared did you feel, would you say? How intense was that? 10 being high, 1 being low?
Probably like a 7 or
7.
8, just because like I usually feel stuff in my chest and like my heart will drop. Like,
Okay, now I'm going to say great again, not because you had feelings in your chest, but great that you noticed it. You noticed in your chest, and where else did you say?
my heart usually drops. I can feel it like in the middle of my chest. Like it just like,
So you had a couple of feelings. It drops in your chest, you said.
yeah.
Wonderful. Anybody else have noticed either feelings or body reactions or thoughts when Samuel was telling his story? Zanaya? Yeah, you want to share?
Yes, I just felt like Spencer said, like I immediately just felt scared. Like she said, like these are the people who are supposed to be helping you and protecting you, and like you shouldn't have to go through that, especially with an adult who's supposed to help you. So I just immediately felt like like a gut punch, like that shouldn't happen.
Yes. So am I right to assume that you felt it in your gut? Okay. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense was the scared feeling you had?
Like a 6 or a 7.
Okay, very good. Now, I'm going to up the game a little bit and ask you before I come back to Samuel. And one of the answers to your question, Samuel, is doing what I'm doing right now. That's how I think we can manage what we're doing, that we need to talk about it, but also don't be shy and going to every impact that the thing had on us. Very important to capture all. Did any of you have an image in your mind while Samuel was talking? Did you see anything? Did you have a memory? Were you, it's a harder thing to think about, but did you see any images in your head? That you could share? Okay. Spencer? Thank you.
I mean, I've had my own like similar situations, but again, it keeps coming back to me that like that power difference. And so I kept seeing like Samuel as more like this, obviously smaller than who his like teacher was or the person was, just kind of like that
Yeah,
different.
yes, very good. These are all the skills, I would say, that you have available to notice. As much as feelings hurt, they are incredibly powerful in knowing yourself. The more you know about yourself and what you're reacting, the more power you will have to do something about it. Imagine having feelings and not know it. You ever been angry and somebody come up to you and say, "Why are you so upset?" And you think you're having a good day, and you got a look on your face. Someone else has to tell you about yourself, that that's ever happened to you. Well, that means you're not fully aware of what's going on. So Samuel, back to your question, which is, and to your story, part of the idea, I would say, is processing with people you care about to notice, how did this affect my body? How did this moment affect my thinking about me? How did this moment affect my voice? How did it affect my memory? And the last thing you said, the person said, I want you to repeat it again because I've forgotten some of it, but compared to the others, I think, but would you say it again?
Yeah, so it was along the lines of the apology. She apologized for calling me by my friend's name. And she said, I'm sorry, like, you're better than all the other Black kids, or smarter.
Yeah, that's a lousy apology. But part of the idea is when you think about, what reaction did you have, I guess, when you heard any of those reactions when you heard that?
Well, I was just very confused because I haven't dealt with that before. So it took me a minute to process. And I think as I've gotten older, I realized how terrible what she said was.
Sure.
Because at the time I didn't know how to react. I didn't really know who to go to. Like if I was supposed to say something back, just
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. And thank you for letting us use this example. Another thing that we would do to help folks is to ask you to try and forgive yourself for not doing or saying something. Because in any abusive situation, dehumanization, it's natural for us to blame ourselves. As many folks as I've worked with in 30, almost 40 years, part of the navigation is to help someone who's just been hurt to not self-blame. Does that make sense? Because you try to figure out, how could this happen to me? Of all the things, what did I do wrong? It's human to do that. Now, here's another thing we do, Samuel, and this is everybody. We ask people, let's say you had a do-over. You couldn't go back then, but if you had a chance, you could go back, any of you, to the story that you heard Samuel. And this is where we often do in groups. If Samuel tells a story, he's got Spencer, Manaya, Adrian, Remy, Zanaya, Isaiah to help, and Selah to help him. But you all could put yourself in Samuel's place. If you had a do-over, Samuel, and you could do anything you wanted, no restrictions. If you wanted to grow wings, you could grow wings. If you wanted the teacher to grow wings, they could grow wings. It doesn't matter. Don't put any restrictions. If you had a second chance at this, is there something you would want to do or say that would relieve you of the burden that you think about when you look back at that moment? Give yourself I'll give you 20 seconds. I'll give you all 20 seconds. If you had a do-over and you were in Samuel's place, you could say anything, you wouldn't get in trouble, still be able to get a license when you're 16. You'll still be able to go to college and become famous and hang out with famous celebrities in LA. Nothing would block you from the future. What would you do? Selah?
Well, no restrictions, probably. I'd immediately react to the "you're better than the other Black students" thing. And in the moment, I would probably be very upset and say, like, well, what is that supposed to mean? Like, what do you think about the other Black students like at our school then? And I feel like I would now have like a completely changed view of this person.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when you said that, did you notice you feeling any particular way when you said that?
Yeah, I kind of felt like there would be so many different things that I'd want to say that it's kind of hard to choose one because
Yes.
like you were talking about earlier, there's like overreacting and underreacting and wanting to like scream at them and say how dare you, or like just brushing it off. So I feel like there's so many different ways that
Yes.
I've gone.
Which is great because you have all these choices that you could make, right? And when we have young folks or anybody who comes up with choices, sometimes it's hard to come up with something. When you hear somebody else that can help you, you might have 5 choices. And I'd ask you, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied were you with that response, Selah, right? 10 being like, oh, I'm very satisfied. 1 being like, it's not really it. How
Probably
satisfied?
like a good 8, because it would be satisfying to just like yell at them, but
Excellent. Excellent. And that's the goal. Back to your question, Samuel, what would we do? We want folks to get to be a higher number in satisfaction in their response rather than a lower number. And did you notice how Selah was wagging her head a little bit, like she put her body into it? So that's another sign for us that we think that it's more of you into the process. Does that make sense? What about for you, Samuel? Would you have anything you'd want to do or say?
Yeah, I mean, no restrictions. I definitely would have said something back because, like Scylla was saying, like, what does that mean? Like, for the other Black students, what does that mean for me compared to all the other students, like, including white students, including Asian students, whatever that means. So,
Yeah. Yes.
I definitely wish I was able to say something back in that situation.
Yes. Well, you have a wonderful question, and thank you for sharing a story, which is not easy to do in front of all these folks, but that's what we do. That's what, unfortunately, it would be great if we lived in a world where these things didn't happen, but we don't live in that world. We live in a world where we must be prepared, and it's absolutely okay. Whatever we feel, anger, sadness, hurt, joy, love, those are all can be turned into protection if we can notice them. So thank you for taking the risk and sharing with us. I appreciate that. Now, you'd also triggered something else, and I'll ask someone else, is we talk about healthy racial comeback lines, and they've been helpful to me. And you just began a little bit of that, right? That's where you say something in the moment. I don't know what it's called now for your generation. In my generation growing up, we used to call, you know, if somebody's dissed you in public, disrespected you, and you had to come back in a moment, right? Some people used to call it busting on people, or they used to call it, gosh, what was it? I don't know, Ms. Johnston, did they have a phrase when you were?
You guys give him the word. Help him out.
Yeah,
You know what he's
do you
trying to say.
call
What's
it?
the word? Snap, come back, what?
Snapping, yeah, snapping on folks. The point is, we would do this over and over and over again as part of the practice until you came up with a comeback line that you could live with, right? And one, it could not get you in trouble. Although you might practice some that would get you in trouble so that you could get yourself revved up to get the right words. You want healthy and unhealthy comeback lines to practice until you came up with one that allowed you to stand up for yourself that fit Samuel. And the one that fit Samuel might not fit Manai. The one that fit Manai might not fit Remy or Adrian. You have to find your own. Just like if Selah's gonna whack her head, when she says what she's gonna say, some other people might do stuff like with the hand and the fist and whatever. It's entirely up to you.
Dr.
Does that make sense?
Stevenson,
Yes.
we got clap back and roasting from the community.
Very good. Thank you, Village. That's what we needed. We all get stuck. We need help sometimes, right? Okay. Any other questions? I haven't heard from Remy and Manaya. Manaya raised her hand. Okay.
Hi, Dr. Stevenson. So this is a question submitted by someone in the chat of this webinar today. Can we ever
Great.
resolve something without directly addressing the racial element of the situation with the perpetrator?
Let me see if I understand. Could you say it one more time, Manaya?
Sure. Can we ever resolve without directly addressing the racial element of the situation with the perpetrator?
Ah, gotcha. I don't think so. Because remember we were talking about reading is around seeing the racial elephant. And you know how sometimes you might have been in the room and you saw the racial elephant, it was kicking up the desks, but you were the only one that saw it. You're the only one that heard it. Everybody else was la, 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 didn't hear anything. And how uncomfortable that is. We tend to take that with us. We tend not to forget. So if you only give half attention to what just happened, if you deny the racial moment, even though you experienced it 100%, you're going to take whatever is there that's left. That's the way I think. And there's not a study on that, but in the therapy that I've done, folks who knew there was more to speak up to in that moment and didn't, it'll still feel unfinished for them. So I would say, I don't think you can do that. Yeah, I do think shape-shifting, as I often engaged in the beginning of my career, I often left a lot of things on the table because why? I didn't want to lose friends. I didn't want people to think I was the angry Black person. Now I really don't care. I actually appreciate it when people think I'm the angry Black person. But I can know there's a time, and it's true for a lot of people, you don't want to get stuck in a stereotype. But there's nothing wrong with being angry. There's nothing wrong with being Black. There's nothing wrong with being a person. How did we let other people define our own humanity as somehow pathological? And I think we take the emotional hit if we don't stand up for ourselves in these moments. Now, I'm not saying you curse everybody out every time you feel it. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you should choose. You should have the power to choose, and that's a very important thing you never want to give away. I got a quote from Frantz Fanon I'll read to you later. Other questions? Okay, we've got Remy.
Hi, Dr. Stevenson. So how should students express their dissatisfaction with the school's attempt to create a sense of belonging when there hasn't been like any significant changes?
Yes. So again, I think you need to be in a safe space with people who understand you. So just what Spencer was bringing up around the power differential. And it is very true that you don't have the freedom to speak. But that doesn't mean you swallow it only and keep it to yourself. But let's say you go back to your group. You have Manaya to talk to, you have Samuel to talk to. Work it out first. Ask somebody what they think about what you went through. Tell your story. And you may say, I may not be ready to let this person know because I haven't practiced it yet. I haven't fully gotten all that has happened to me. But if I go back and tell my parents, maybe I feel safe telling them. Maybe I feel safe telling Zanaya or Miss Johnson. Either way, you've got work to do to manage that rejection. And it may take, I've had folks who say, decided I'm not going to go back to the person because I don't feel that's the right decision for me. But they didn't suppress the feeling. They still experienced it and they got feedback from others and they didn't deal with it alone. And so I would say the same to a school system, right? How many people are on your side? Which faculty can you go through who get this, who appreciate your narrative, who won't question it? And I would also say, if you know people who don't appreciate your story, to not share it with them, because that's not healthy either. You can't take care of other people's ignorance while you're still trying to learn. That's not always an easy decision, but I would strongly affirm your right to not share who you are with people who you can't trust. Now, I think part of your question, Remy, is what can the school do? And part of that is, I think leaders also have to be in the space of sharing their stories and be accountable. If you know that there are leaders in your school who are not afraid to tell their story, then that's an umbrella for you, right? You can't be, if all of the revolution comes from the students, man, that's a big climb. We need leaders who you can follow to give you cover, if that makes sense. Others, okay, who else? I got, let me look around, Spencer.
Okay, so I have a question that's sort of similar to one that someone in the PSV community who is watching today asked, but I'll give like a bit of background on like where this is coming from.
But
so like recently, like super recently, like this Friday, I was in a class and like one of my classmates or peers made like an inappropriate racial comment and everyone was like looking at each other, waiting for our teacher to say something because it was so like blatantly off-putting and like weird. But on that note, what advice do you have for educators when racial issues arise in the classroom that may not be prepared to deal with that or it catches them off guard?
I think just admit to it. I mean, to be honest, it's natural for any of us. You know, that deer in the headlights moment, we all have had them. You say, all right, this is my drum major for justice. What King talked about, I'm going to step up, boom, boom, boom. And then instead of stepping up, you tripped up and fell down. It's human, just real. So, and I have seen teachers, I myself have struggled and then wish I could. And I've written about my stories when I wish I could have, should have said something. So educators are human just like everyone else. And the question is, if it's pointed out to them, can they admit to it? That's real courage. You don't have control over that as a student, but you hope that somebody would say, look, you know what? Last class, I was stunned. Here's what was happening to me. I didn't really, but now I'd like to approach it. And then that would be a better way in my view. So we have to have, you know, a sort of affirmation and protection and accountability for educators and adults as much as we do for other folks. But I would say the same message to police officers. In our training with police officers, I get it if you got stunned, but you got to learn from it. This is part of your craft. You've got to get better at this, or else you're not going to be competent in your job. You got to follow up, Spencer? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of. So say in this situation, like I'm gonna have this class again on Monday, like, and she doesn't say anything. Is it my job as a student to like tell her that this like bothered me when it was so like blatant, like, or?
Mm-hmm. I think it's not your job to teach her how to do her job, but I think it is a choice that you have to make about how much that affected you and whether you want to speak up to it for you, not for the school, for the county, for the country, but for Spencer. If Spencer says, I cannot walk another step without bringing this up, then I think that's entirely up to you. They're going to have to make the choice whether they're going to listen to Spencer or not, right? And that's just reality. But I would say all of these experiences, when you speak up, it's always a triumph speaking it for yourself. You don't always change the situation, but you have an amazing story you could tell. Think about it. Now, I'm not encouraging you, again, to say everything that comes out. You have to really practice that. You ever tell a joke and then screw up the joke punchline, and then instead of everybody laughing at the joke, they're laughing at you? I hate when that happens. Part of the reason is we didn't practice the punchline. We didn't practice. So sometimes we have to practice how we speak up for ourselves so that we can get it right and speak it the way we feel comfortable. And that may take some time, but that's a choice that you make. what impact did it have on you? Did you CLCBE Spencer before you decided to speak up? Right? And that's the healing part. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay. I got Selah. Hand up, right? Did I miss? No, I'm sorry. I didn't get, yeah, I missed. Hey, Adrian, I'll come back to you later, Selah. Thanks.
So I had a question that was submitted by someone in the PSV community. How do we engage other racial and ethnic groups in the conversation around anti-racist work, racial literacy, and social justice so that they feel as much ownership in it as we do in the Black community?
Well, I think if they're friends, I would still start, for all your questions, I'm a little biased. I would say first CLCBE, calculate, locate, communicate, breathe, and exhale. What would it be like to start that conversation? And let's say there are 20 different ways to start it. Which way does Adrian want to start it? What's most comfortable for you, right? To be on a mission is important, but you want to be prepared. So the way Adrian would start it might be different than the way Remy would start that conversation. If you were choosing, I'm going to speak up. But I think once you chose to do that, I'd be interested in what would make you most comfortable, right? Sometimes starting with a story, sometimes just saying it quite directly. I wouldn't know that until I got to know you. But I think the same things that we've been talking about, how do you prepare yourself? We do a lot of role playing in our work. And so just like Samuel described this situation, we would role play. Let's imagine we role play and make Selah had to be the teacher and Spencer had to play Samuel's role, right? And we'd role play it over and over again until Samuel, the director, said, no, that's not quite it, do it again. No, that's not quite it, do it again. And then we'd have some of you make judgments about how you might go about being Samuel in that moment as a way to practice. The same I would do with you, Adrian. Who is it that you're speaking to? Are you speaking to a group? Are you speaking to a friend, to a stranger? And all of those could be acted out until you felt comfortable. It's just another form of practice. Cool, Selah, I think you're up.
Someone in the chat wants to know if you have any healthy comeback lines.
Yeah, but I think you all probably have better ones. So I'm trying on our website to create a portal for healthy racial comeback lines. We're going to do it by the middle of next year. That's our plan. If you go to racial literacy, recastrace.com or thelionstory.org, we're going to have portals just for young people and why they were helpful to you. But one of the first classes we did this with in the New Jersey school, there was a young man. We asked the class, what would you do if you got called the N-word? And in the process, it was a group of 35 Black and brown students. And everybody in the room said, they would all say, be physical. We'd fight them if they said it. Except one guy. This guy was the star football player on the team. He was the largest person in the room. And he was like, whenever he walked down the hall, everybody moves out of the way for him. He was that gigantic and he had that much status and power. He said nothing. So I walked over to him. I said, well, what would you do? And he looked at me like I was crazy. Like, are you kidding? Like nobody would ever say that to me, right? He had that kind of attitude. I said, well, humor me. Just tell me, what would you do if someone said the N-word? He said, of course I'd beat him up. And then looked at me again like I'm an idiot. I said, thank you. A week goes by, so happens, on our way into the school, a group of students from the class come running up to us and saying, over to our car actually, and saying, guess what? I said, what? He said, he got called the N-word. And then they ran away. And then they came back again and they said, don't tell him we told you that, okay? And then they ran away. And so we get to the class I'm in the class, I see the young man sitting in the back, and I like to mess with people. So I go up to him, I say, I heard that you got called the N-word. And he said, yes. And I said, well, what did you do? Because I like to mess with people. Did you beat him up? He said, no. I got paralyzed. I didn't say anything. He froze. And then we opened up the door to have people on his behalf come up with comeback lines. And so one of those comeback lines that one of the students said was, she was a brilliant student. I think she was a junior. Her strategy after practicing was, for the next 2 minutes, she would start like this. Do you know the origin of that word? Well, let me tell you. And then she would give the history of the N-word for 2 minutes straight and not let the person get a word in edgewise. Beautiful comeback line. Not everybody can pull that off, but she was able to do it. Another one would be like, excuse me, did you mean N-word with an ER or AH? I just want to know. Because if it was an ER, I'd have to kick your butt. But if it was an AH, I might let you slide. Very creative. Funny, but creative. What is the purpose of a comeback line? Purpose of a comeback line is not to retaliate, but it is to confront. It's to stand up for yourself. And to say in a nutshell, I reject your rejection of me. Now, you have to say it to yourself first. That's most important. You can choose not to say it. And if you really are really stuck and you don't have anything, but you want to say something, you could simply say, excuse me, and just put it in the other person's court, the ball in the other person's court. Or you could do like Selah, you could wag your head and go, excuse me. And that gives you a little bit more time to come up with something really smart to say, but it's on them to have to respond. Does that make sense? You can come up with anything as a comeback line, but it has to represent, I reject your rejection of me. It has to be practiced, has to be in your own style. You can't borrow someone else's style, it has to come from you. It also has to be on a satisfactory scale of like 7 or above. You have to be satisfied with it. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, Zanaya, I think you're the only one that hasn't had a shot. Do you want to ask a question?
Let me see. I think there was one person from the PSV community who asked, what are some best practices for schools who have embedded racial literacy into their curriculum? Also, the focus seems to be at the high school level. How can racial literacy be appropriate for the elementary school curriculum?
Right. Well, it's a great question. In several places, some of the projects I mentioned to you earlier, the play project where we use physical activity and racial literacy, is happening in a school district in Binghamton, New York. Binghamton High School started with the football coach, who is a local hero in Binghamton, saved lives of young Black and brown people. We got together and started with the football team practicing racial literacy, and then it spread throughout the school district. So the elementary, middle, and high schoolers have a class on racial literacy. And so once it's integrated into a class, you've got lots of chance to practice, in our view. But their football team and their athletic sports often would play games in racially hostile spaces where they could not play a game without epithets coming from the crowd. It would bother the players. It would affect their sleep habits. There are players who had things thrown at them, as well as called names when they go on away games. So integrating it into the school curriculum, I see, is a wonderful way to help young people think about not just fitness, but also your health, your emotional well-being. Families coming together is another way. You know, just because you're a parent doesn't mean you know of color, doesn't mean you know how to talk about race. And what we've learned a lot is that a lot of parents might try to have the talk, but then they start remembering their own traumas from their childhoods, and it gets in the way. It's supposed to. It's actually trying to tell them there's stuff that's unfinished. So we would split the parents from the kids. We wouldn't let them talk until they had spent time literally working out some of their own past stories, because everybody has a racial story, and using that story when you talk to your child, and children using their stories when they talk to parents. And I'll just add one thing. Young people have always told us that when their parents, they often are in love with them so much, they will only tell them the good stuff or the positive stuff. And if you're a student and you're in the middle of a challenge, hearing about the mountaintop is not as useful. You want to hear about the valley. How did you get through the valley? I don't know if that's true for you all, but this is what I've heard. And sometimes when parents tell their valley stories, not their mountaintop stories, young people have told us that's been very useful in those family kinds of conversations. So those are just, I don't know if I fully answer your question, but those are a couple of things that come to mind. Also, we're targeting coaches. We're targeting barbers and beauticians because these are influential people in the neighborhoods. In some of the barbershops, you can get a lesson about politics. You may not want the lesson. That's beside the point. When you're in the chair and you're being taken care of, you are a captive audience, and you could walk away with some gems of stuff. Your coaches in particular, are pretty influential people. So. Thank you for the question. Manaya.
Okay. Can you speak to the difference in experiences between Black boys and Black girls when it comes to racially stressful situations? Do we typically deal with them differently?
No. I mean, I think there are differences. And if you look in the literature, there are ways that families have talked to girls differently than boys in Black and brown communities, giving boys sometimes messages. And I think this varies by community, but boys messages about what to watch out, and girls get more message of cultural pride. But we think everybody should get both. What to prepare for that's dangerous, but also how to feel positive about who you are. Those combinations are real important. We found that many times girls are much more vocal when they've gone through things than the boys are in ways. But I would say without practice, none of us are fully equipped, because no one comes ready to manage dehumanization. You don't walk into school thinking, oh, this is going to be dehumanization day. You simply are not prepared, and it's not something that we should acquiesce to. But my sense is everybody can use practice and support to navigate this process, so that you don't have to walk away thinking it's you. I think Isaiah, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, this is the last question. And
okay.
The question is, what are some of the best ways for families to practice building racial literacy at home? How do they get that conversation started?
To start telling stories. In my family, my brother, sister, and I, we were close. Not everybody's close with your family, I get that. But it has been helpful to tell stories, to hear stories from our parents when they were struggling with these kinds of issues. In the Embrace project, what we used, and we also had another project, we would have these ask you any question moments where we'd have 5 or 6 families together, right? And the children would group together and the parents would group together, and we say, you can ask any question of the parents that you want. And the parents, you can ask the children any question that you want, but you got to ask it as a group, right? You can't target one person. That way the kids didn't feel singled out and the parents didn't feel singled out. And you can have the choice to not answer the question if you don't want to. It's entirely up to you. But these are questions you're dying to know about parents around race, let's just say. And some of the most beautiful questions came from children as young as 6 years old or 5 years old, that parents were not fully prepared for. But I would say start with storytelling, because the story has so many exits and it has so many on-ramps that there's not one way to see a story. You can be feeling in blame and giving at the same time. So, but I think giving permission for adults and parents to tell, and young people to ask those questions I always wanted to ask, but never did, I think would be a good start.
And I think, Dr. Stevenson, another good way would be for the adults and the families to join us on October 3rd for the racial literacy skill building workshop, because to your point earlier, there's a lot of stuff that as adults, we don't realize we have not dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is our first attempt to help parents unearth some of that stuff so that then we can begin to have those conversations with our children.
Nice move, Ms. Johnson.
Like that plug. I do just want to say, though, please, everyone, do consider joining us for that event, because I cannot stress to you enough how practical this is. This really is about practicing, like putting yourself in the moment so that you are better prepared for when it happens, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and you will be caught off guard every time. So the more, it's like building that muscle. It's like being media trained. It's like you have to practice it. And I think we all are well-intentioned in thinking we will, but there's nothing like being in a situation where you are amongst people where that's the shared goal and you are forced to do it, to carve out the time to do it. That's a beautiful gift. So we are out of time. Thank you, students, for joining us. I really do appreciate it. I really want to make this commitment to working with the Lion Story to figure out how we can build something that does offer this for the students. Because again, this is just such an important skill for them to have. We're definitely committed to offering it for the adults, and we're going to start that again on October 3rd. Dr. Stevenson, it is always a pleasure. There's never enough time with you. I feel like we could go for another hour and a half very easily. But we will do that again soon. I appreciate your time. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So everyone, we will put this up on the PSV YouTube channel in the coming days, and be on the lookout for our email to register for the October 3rd workshop. Thank you for joining us.